Welcome. Wherever you are listening from tonight, allow the day to settle behind you. Let the room remain dim. Let the quiet stay uninterrupted. There is nothing you need to focus on, nothing you need to remember, and nothing you need to stay awake for. This story will unfold slowly, and you are free to rest whenever sleep arrives. Tonight's story takes place in a small town, a quiet street, a family home, a night that ended without sound. This is the story of the Villisca Axe Murders. In the early hours of a summer morning in 1912, 8 people were murdered in their sleep inside a modest house in Villisca, Iowa. There were no screams reported. No one in the neighborhood heard a struggle. The town woke to silence, unaware that something irreversible had already taken place. What followed was not a quick resolution, but decades of uncertainty. Investigations began, stalled, resumed, and faded again. Suspects were questioned, arrests were made, trials were held, and still no one was ever convicted. The case remained open not because it was ignored, but because it resisted explanation. This story is not told to shock. It is not told to disturb. It is told slowly, carefully, and without interruption. You do not need to follow every detail. You do not need to hold the names or the timeline in your mind. Let the narration move gently, like background thought. If your attention drifts, let it drift. If sleep arrives before the story ends, allow it to come without resistance. The town was quiet that night. The house did not call for help, and the world continued unaware. This is a story shaped by stillness, by what was not heard, by what was discovered only after the fact. It unfolds not through urgency, but through absence. You are safe where you are. The night is calm, and the story can begin. In the early years of the 20th century, Villisca was a small, orderly town shaped by routine and familiarity. Surrounded by farmland, it functioned as a close-knit community where daily life followed predictable patterns. Most people worked nearby, worshipped together, and recognized one another by face, if not by name. Strangers were noticed, but rarely suspected. The town's rhythm was slow and deliberate. Mornings began early. Evenings ended quietly. The absence of electricity in many homes meant that nights settled quickly into darkness, with lamps extinguished and doors closed by habit rather than fear. Safety was assumed, not enforced. Villisca was not isolated, but it was contained. The railroad connected it to nearby towns, bringing goods and visitors. Yet life within the town remained self-contained. News traveled through conversation rather than urgency. Events unfolded at a human pace, leaving little room for unpredictability. Families formed the center of social life. Children walked freely between homes. Neighbors watched over one another without formal coordination. Doors were often unlocked. The idea that violence could arrive without warning did not fit the community's understanding of the world. The Morehouse, like many others, stood among similar homes along quiet streets. It did not stand out. It was part of the town's ordinary fabric, blending into a landscape defined by familiarity and repetition. Houses were places of rest and refuge, not targets. At the time, crime was understood as something external. Trouble came from elsewhere, from cities or transient spaces, not from within familiar walls. When crimes did occur, they were typically small and personal, resolved through local knowledge rather than investigation. This sense of predictability shaped how people paid attention. It shaped how they did not. When nights fell silent, they were trusted. When doors remained closed, they were assumed secure. The community did not prepare for intrusion because intrusion was not part of lived experience. Understanding this context matters, because when the town later woke to discover what had occurred inside one of its homes, it was not only the crime itself that unsettled Villisca, it was the realization that familiarity had not protected them, that routine had not warned them. that silence had concealed something unimaginable. The town had not changed overnight. The streets remained the same. The houses stood where they always had. But something beneath the surface had shifted, quietly and permanently. In Villisca, the early 20th century was defined by trust. And it was that trust that would later make the events that followed feel impossible to reconcile. The setting was not one of chaos or neglect. It was one of order and expectation. And within that order, something entered without being seen, heard, or anticipated. The town would never experience quiet in quite the same way again. At the center of the home on 2nd Street lived the Moore family, whose lives reflected the rhythms and expectations of Villisca itself. They were not isolated or mysterious figures. They were known, visible, and woven into the daily fabric of the town. Josiah Moore was a respected businessman who worked in agricultural supply. His work connected him to farmers throughout the surrounding area, and his reputation was that of a steady, reliable man. He was known for consistency rather than ambition, someone who valued order and routine. His days followed familiar patterns, shaped by work, church, and family life. His wife, Sarah Moore, managed the household and cared for their children. She was described as attentive and practical, deeply invested in the well-being of her family. Like many women of the time, her world centered around the home, where structure and predictability were valued. The Moore house reflected that sensibility. It was orderly, comfortable, and shaped by repetition rather than display. Together, they were raising 4 children. Herman Moore, the eldest, was 11 years old. He was described as responsible and helpful, often assisting with chores and caring for his younger siblings. He occupied the role of the oldest child naturally, carrying expectations quietly rather than resisting them. Catherine Moore, 10 years old, was close in age to Herman. She attended school regularly and was known within the community. Her life revolved around family routines, schoolwork, and church activities, like many children in Villisca. The younger children, Boyd Moore and Paul Moore, were still firmly within the world of childhood. Their days were shaped by play, learning, and the rhythms set by their parents. The house accommodated their presence naturally, filled with the quiet energy of a family accustomed to sharing space. The Moore family attended church regularly and participated in community events. They were neither reclusive nor unusually prominent. Their lives did not draw attention. They followed expectations rather than challenged them. This ordinariness is important because it left little reason for anyone to view the family as vulnerable or at risk. Inside the house, daily life followed structure. Meals were prepared and eaten together. Children were expected to be home by evening. Bedrooms were shared and arranged simply. Nothing about the household suggested disorder or conflict. It was a place of repetition, shaped by habit rather than unpredictability. The family's presence in the community reinforced a sense of safety. People knew where the Moore children lived. They recognized Josiah at work and church. The house itself was familiar, its lights seen on and off at predictable hours. There was no known tension surrounding the family, no public disputes, no financial distress that stood out, no rumors that placed them at the center of conflict. In retrospect, this absence of visible threat made what happened feel even more disconnected from explanation. The Moore family did not live on the margins of Villisca. They lived at its center. They represented the very thing the town believed was secure: a stable household, familiar faces, predictable routines, a life that did not invite intrusion. That sense of security would later become impossible to reconcile with the silence that followed. Because when the Moore family went to sleep that night, they did so with the same assumptions shared by nearly everyone in Villisca: that home was a place of rest, that the night would pass quietly, that morning would come as it always had. Nothing in their lives suggested otherwise, and it was that ordinary trust, shared without question, that would make their absence the following day so deeply unsettling. the Moore family did not disappear from uncertainty or chaos. They disappeared from stability. And in a town built on familiarity, that loss would echo far beyond the walls of their home. On the night that would later define the history of Villisca, the Moore family was not alone in their home. Two young sisters were visiting, their presence the result of an ordinary decision that carried no sense of risk or consequence at the time. Their names were Ina Stillinger and Lena Stillinger, and they were part of the quiet social fabric of the town. Ina was 8 years old, and Lena was 12. They lived nearby and were well known within the community. Like many children in Villisca, their lives revolved around family, school, and church. They were accustomed to spending time in other homes, especially those of friends. Overnight visits were common and unremarkable, shaped by trust rather than caution. That evening, the sisters had attended a church program with the Moore family. The event was routine, the kind of gathering that reinforced familiarity and connection, rather than introducing anything new. When it ended, the girls expressed a desire to stay overnight with the Moore children. This was not unusual. Such visits happened often, especially after social events that ran late. Permission was given without hesitation. The Moore household was considered safe and welcoming. Josiah and Sarah Moore were trusted adults, and their home was familiar to the Stillinger family. There was no reason to question the arrangement. It was a simple extension of community life, one family trusting another. Inside the house, space was made easily. Children shared rooms, beds were adjusted. The presence of the Stillinger sisters did not disrupt routine. It blended into it. The house held the quiet energy of children settling in for the night, voices lowering, movement slowing. The significance of the sisters' presence would only be understood later. At the time, their stay did not represent vulnerability or exposure. It represented belonging. The ability of children to move freely between homes was a defining feature of Villisca life. It was evidence of how deeply trust was embedded into daily routine. The Stillinger sisters did not arrive with plans or expectations beyond sleep and mourning. They brought no bags prepared for long stays. They did not leave notes behind. Their visit was meant to end the following day, seamlessly and without remark. Their inclusion in the household that night expanded the tragedy, but it did not alter the nature of the home itself. The Moore house remained a place of safety, even with extra occupants, or at least it was believed to be. The presence of the sisters underscores one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. This was not a private moment confined to a single family. It was a shared space, open and ordinary, reflecting the way the community lived. Nothing about their visit introduced danger. Nothing about their presence suggested risk. Nothing marked the night as different from any other. And yet, their inclusion in the house that night would later stand as a reminder of how far-reaching the consequences of that silence would be. The Stillinger sisters were not outsiders. They were not accidental witnesses. They were simply children, spending the night with friends. In a town built on familiarity and trust, that simple act carried no weight, until the morning came, and the ordinary became impossible to understand. The evening of June 10th, 1912, began in Villisca the way many evenings did. The air was warm, the daylight lingered, and the town moved toward night without hurry. It was a Monday, ordinary in every sense, shaped by routine rather than anticipation. Nothing about the date suggested it would be remembered. Earlier that evening, the Moore family attended a church program at the local Presbyterian church. The event was social and familiar, attended by neighbors and friends. Children participated, adults conversed quietly, and the gathering ended without incident. The Stillinger sisters were there as well, accompanying the Moore children. The night carried the gentle fatigue that follows community events, where people return home ready for rest. After the program concluded, the group walked back toward the Moore home. The streets were calm, Lamps glowed softly in windows. The town settled, as it always had, with doors closing and voices fading. There was no sense of being followed, no interruption, no sign that anything unusual had entered the evening. Inside the house, the family and their guests prepared for bed. Shoes were removed. Lamps were lit briefly, then turned down. Children were directed toward their sleeping arrangements. The adults moved through familiar motions, closing doors and preparing the house for night. Everything followed expectation. The presence of the stilling assisters did not alter routine. It fit within it. Sleeping arrangements were simple. The more children shared rooms, and the stilling assisters were placed together in an upstairs bedroom. The house was not large, but it was comfortable and familiar. Each room held the quiet stillness of people accustomed to sleeping without fear. At some point, the lamps were extinguished. The house went dark. Outside, the town of Villisca slept. No one reported hearing raised voices. No one recalled sounds of movement or alarm. The night passed unnoticed, indistinguishable from countless others before it. What makes this night difficult to grasp is not what is known, but how little stands out. There is no recorded argument, no visitor reported, no interruption documented. The evening does not contain a moment that signals transition from safety to danger. The house offered no resistance to sleep. Windows were left as they normally were. Doors were closed, but not secured with fear in mind. The family trusted the stillness around them. The town trusted itself. At some point during the night, something changed. There is no witness to that change, no sound to mark it, no movement observed by neighbors. Whatever entered the house did so quietly, without waking the town or announcing itself. The people inside did not call for help. This silence has endured as one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. 8 people were present in the home, children and adults, and yet nothing escaped the walls. The night absorbed everything without reflection. The events of that night would only become visible after the fact, discovered rather than experienced. The darkness concealed what daylight would later reveal, leaving behind no memory of sound, no record of struggle. June 10th ended the way it began. Quietly, ordinarily, without warning, the town slept through it, and by the time morning arrived, the night had already taken with it something Villisca would never fully recover. Morning came to Villisca on June 11th, 1912, without any immediate sense that something had gone wrong. The sun rose as it always had, casting light over familiar streets and quiet homes. Neighbors began their routines, stepping outside, preparing for the day, unaware that one house on 2nd Street had not awakened. Concern began subtly. A neighbor noticed that the Moore house was unusually still. Curtains remained drawn. No one emerged. The children, who were normally active in the mornings, were not seen. This absence did not initially suggest danger, but it felt out of place. In a town where patterns were deeply familiar, even small deviations carried weight. As the morning progressed, the stillness became harder to ignore. Mary Peckham, a neighbor and friend of the family, grew uneasy. She had expected to see movement by now. The quiet lingered longer than it should have. Eventually, she decided to check on the household, assuming perhaps that illness or oversleeping explained the silence. Approaching the house, she knocked on the door. There was no response. She knocked again, louder this time, calling out names she had spoken many times before. Still, there was nothing. The house remained closed to sound and movement, as if holding its breath. Concern turned into fear. Peckham sought help from nearby neighbors. Together, they returned to the Moore home. The front door was locked, but that alone did not explain the silence. Through the windows, nothing appeared disturbed. The house looked intact, unchanged from the night before. Eventually, they contacted local authorities. When the town marshal arrived, he approached cautiously. Entering the house, he was immediately struck by the darkness inside, even though it was already morning. Curtains remained closed. The air felt heavy and unmoving. The house did not greet the day. What he discovered inside unfolded slowly, room by room. The first bedroom revealed the Moore parents. They were still in their bed, unmoving. The scene was quiet, almost unreal. There were no signs of struggle in the room. The bed was intact. The silence was complete. As the marshal moved through the house, the scale of what had occurred became impossible to deny. In another room lay the Moore children, together, as they had gone to sleep. Upstairs, in a separate bedroom, the Stillinger sisters were found where they had been placed for the night. Each discovery added weight rather than shock. The house did not feel chaotic. It felt frozen. There were no screams remembered, no sounds recalled, no warning heard. The realization settled slowly but firmly. Something had happened during the night that no one outside the house had perceived. 8 people had been killed while the town slept undisturbed. Neighbors gathered quietly outside. Word spread not through shouting or alarm, but through hushed voices and widening eyes. The street filled with people standing in disbelief, struggling to reconcile what they were hearing with what they were seeing. The Moore house looked the same, the town looked the same, and yet everything had changed. Authorities attempted to secure the scene, but the shock overwhelmed protocol. People entered the house out of curiosity, concern, and disbelief. Friends, neighbors, and onlookers moved through the rooms. They touched objects. They stood where investigators would later wish no one had stood. In 1912, crime scenes were not understood the way they are now. Preservation was not immediate. The weight of the moment overtook procedure. The morning discovery became a public event. Newspapers arrived. Townspeople crowded near the house. The stillness that had defined the night was replaced by quiet confusion. People spoke in low tones, trying to understand how something so violent could exist within such familiarity. What remained most disturbing was the lack of disruption. Furniture was not overturned. Windows were not broken. The house bore no outward sign of intrusion. The violence had not announced itself loudly enough to wake anyone. It had remained contained, absorbed by walls that were assumed to protect. As the reality settled in, Villisca began to change. Trust fractured. Familiar streets felt altered. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now closed more carefully. The morning discovery did not just reveal a crime. It revealed vulnerability where none had been acknowledged before. The house was no longer simply a home. It became a boundary between what Villisca believed about itself and what it could no longer deny. The morning had brought light, but it had not brought clarity. It had exposed silence rather than explanation. And as the sun climbed higher, the town stood still, trying to comprehend how the night had passed so quietly, while everything inside one house was taken away. Once the reality of what had occurred became unavoidable, attention turned inward, toward the space where the night had unfolded unseen. The house on 2nd Street did not resemble a place of chaos. It appeared contained, almost orderly, as though the violence that had taken place had been absorbed rather than expressed. The layout of the home was simple and familiar. Downstairs held the common areas and the bedroom of Josiah and Sarah. More upstairs were the rooms where the children and the Stillinger sisters slept. The staircase connecting the floors was narrow, positioned in a way that required anyone moving through the house to pass close to the sleeping spaces. This detail would later weigh heavily on investigators and observers alike. In the bedroom of the Moore parents, the scene was quiet and still. They were found in their bed, covered as if sleep had not been disturbed for long. The room showed no signs of a struggle. Furniture was undisturbed. Nothing appeared broken or displaced. The violence had not erupted outward. It had remained controlled, contained within the space itself. In the children's room, the more children were found together. Their placement suggested they had been asleep when it happened. The room did not bear the marks of resistance or movement. The beds remained in place. The walls did not show damage. The silence of the space felt heavier than disorder ever could. Upstairs, the bedroom where the Stillinger sisters slept was similarly unchanged. The girls had been placed there intentionally for the night, separated from the rest of the family only by the staircase. Their room, like the others, did not tell a story of panic. It told a story of interruption. Throughout the house, one detail repeated itself. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors were intact. Windows were unbroken. Locks showed no damage. Whoever entered the house had done so without drawing attention, and whoever moved through it did so without urgency. The absence of damage did not suggest carelessness. It suggested control. Curtains had been drawn. Lamps were off. The house had been dark. This darkness, combined with the familiarity of the layout, would have allowed someone to move quietly, guided by memory or observation rather than light. The house did not resist movement. It yielded to it. Investigators noted that mirrors and windows were covered with clothing and fabric. This detail stood out, not because it explained anything directly, but because it suggested intention. The coverings were not accidental. They had been placed deliberately, as though to prevent reflection or observation, even within the house itself. The weapon used was found on the property. An axe belonging to Josiah Moore had been left behind. It was not taken. It was not hidden far from the house. This detail unsettled many. The act had not been hurried. The person responsible did not appear concerned with escape or concealment beyond the immediate moment. Blood was present, but not scattered. There was no evidence of prolonged movement between rooms. The violence did not trail through the house. It occurred where people slept, and it ended there. This containment reinforced the impression that the event unfolded without interruption or resistance. The house offered no signs of interruption from outside. No neighbors reported hearing footsteps, voices, or cries. No one recalled doors opening or closing during the night. The walls of the home had kept the town unaware, preserving the illusion of peace beyond them. As more people entered the house in the hours after discovery, the original scene became increasingly difficult to interpret. Neighbors, officials, and onlookers moved through rooms without understanding the importance of preservation. Objects were touched, positions were altered. What little the house might have revealed became harder to distinguish. Yet even before contamination, the house resisted explanation. It did not tell a story of intrusion. It did not tell a story of struggle. It did not tell a story of chaos. It told a story of silence. The stillness inside the Moore home was not natural, but it was complete. It suggested that whatever had happened was over before it could echo beyond the walls. The house had not cried out. It had held everything inside. This internal quiet would define the case as much as the violence itself, because inside the house there were no answers waiting to be found. Only the unsettling realization that a place built for rest and safety had absorbed something unthinkable without leaving behind a sound loud enough to be remembered. And once that silence had settled, it did not lift again. As investigators attempted to understand what had happened inside the Moore house, attention inevitably settled on the weapon that had been used, not because of its brutality, but because of what its use suggested about the night itself. The axe was not brought from elsewhere. It belonged to the household. It had been taken from the property and left behind once the night was over. This detail mattered. Using a weapon already present inside the home reduced the need for preparation. It suggested familiarity, opportunity, or patience. The person responsible did not arrive carrying tools. Instead, the house itself provided what was used, reinforcing the idea that the intrusion was quiet and unhurried. The method followed a consistent pattern. Each victim was attacked while asleep. There was no evidence that anyone had been awakened in time to react or escape. The positioning of the bodies indicated that the violence began and ended at the bedside. This consistency suggested intent rather than impulse. The actions were repeated with control, room by room, without interruption. The axe itself showed signs of deliberate use. Rather than the sharp blade, the blunt end was used in most instances. This choice is often noted because it implies a level of force that does not rely on cutting or precision, but on weight and repetition. The decision to use the blunt side has been interpreted in many ways over the years, but it remains one of the defining technical aspects of the case. What is striking is not only how the weapon was used, but how the house responded. There were no signs of prolonged movement. No evidence of victims fleeing from one room to another. No trail suggesting panic or pursuit. The acts occurred where people slept, and they did not spread beyond those spaces. The house absorbed the event without echo. Another detail that drew attention was the positioning of the axe afterward. It was left behind, cleaned to some degree, and placed on the property rather than taken. This absence of concern about discovery suggested that escape did not depend on speed. The person responsible did not act as though pursuit was imminent. The town's silence appears to have been assumed. Investigators also noted the coverings placed over windows and mirrors. Clothing and fabric had been used to block reflections and outside light. This action required time and intention. It was not necessary for escape. It did not prevent discovery the next morning. Its purpose remains uncertain, but it reinforced the impression that the night unfolded without haste. The method did not resemble a spontaneous act. It required moving through the house quietly, navigating stairs, entering multiple rooms, and repeating the same action without drawing attention. This suggests familiarity with interior spaces and confidence that no one would intervene. The absence of noise remains difficult to reconcile. 8 people were present, children and adults, and yet no cries were reported. No sounds escaped into the street. This does not imply that no sound was made, only that whatever sound occurred was contained within walls that were never expected to fail. The method relied on sleep. Sleep lowers resistance. It blurs awareness. It removes the instinct to respond immediately. The choice of timing suggests that the person responsible understood this, whether through experience or intuition. The night was selected because the house would be quiet and the town would not notice. What the method does not suggest is frenzy. There is no evidence of uncontrolled movement or emotional escalation. The repetition across rooms implies deliberation. The act did not spiral. It remained contained until it was complete. For investigators, the method raised more questions than it answered. Was the person familiar with the family? Was the person familiar with the house? Was the person watching, waiting, or passing through? The axe and the method together painted a picture of restraint rather than chaos, of silence rather than confrontation, of something done deliberately in a place that did not expect it. This understanding would later influence theories, but it did not provide resolution, because even when method is understood, motive can remain hidden, and in this case, the method explained how the night unfolded, but not why it occurred at all. The axe remained, the house remained, and the method, once revealed, only deepened the quiet unease that surrounded everything that followed. In the hours and days following the discovery, the investigation began under conditions that would later be recognized as deeply compromised. In 1912, modern forensic procedures did not yet exist in any meaningful form, and the concept of preserving a crime scene was still unfamiliar to most communities. What unfolded in Villisca was not negligence, but a reflection of the time. The house was never truly secured before investigators could fully assess the scene. Neighbors, officials, reporters, and curious onlookers moved freely through the home. People entered bedrooms, stood beside beds, touched objects, and walked the same paths the intruder had once taken. Footprints overlapped, positions shifted. Whatever fragile traces had existed were quickly blurred beyond recognition. Local authorities did what they could with the tools they had. The town marshal and county officials examined the house, recorded observations, and attempted to reconstruct events. But without established protocols, the investigation relied heavily on memory and impression. Notes were taken, statements were gathered, yet much of what could have been preserved had already been altered by human presence. The sheer scale of the crime drew attention far beyond Villisca. Newspapers arrived quickly, turning the house into a focal point of national interest. Reporters published vivid descriptions, sometimes entering the home themselves to observe the scene firsthand. This attention amplified pressure but did not improve clarity. Information spread faster than understanding. Suspicions formed early. Authorities began questioning townspeople, travelers, and anyone who might have passed through Villisca in the days before the murders. Without physical evidence to guide them, the investigation expanded outward, following possibilities rather than facts. This breadth created noise rather than focus. One of the earliest missteps was the assumption that someone local must be responsible. This belief shaped questioning and narrowed perspective prematurely. While familiarity might explain access, it also risked overlooking other possibilities. As time passed, investigators would move back and forth between local suspicion and broader theories, never settling firmly on either. Another challenge lay in the absence of a clear timeline. No one had heard anything during the night. No one had seen anyone leave. The crime existed between sleep and morning, without witnesses to anchor it in time. This made it difficult to test alibis or establish sequences with confidence. Evidence handling was inconsistent. The axe was examined, but without modern techniques, little could be learned from it. Blood patterns were observed, but not documented scientifically. Items moved through multiple hands. Each transfer reduced certainty rather than increasing it. As the investigation continued, frustration grew. Officials felt pressure to produce answers for a town that could not accept the absence of explanation. Rumors began to circulate. Accusations surfaced quietly, sometimes publicly. The lack of progress invited speculation, and speculation filled gaps that evidence could not. The investigation began to lose cohesion. Different authorities pursued different leads. Cooperation existed, but coordination was limited. Without a central framework, the case fragmented into threads that did not reconnect. Each new idea diverted attention rather than building toward resolution. Despite these missteps, it is important to understand the context. The investigation was not careless by intention. It was constrained by knowledge, resources, and expectations of the era. The idea that a crime scene should be protected from contamination was not yet ingrained. The response reflected community shock more than procedural failure. Still, the consequences were lasting. By the time investigative methods matured, the opportunity to apply them meaningfully to this case had passed. The house had given up what little it could offer. The early days, where clarity might have emerged, were gone. The investigation continued, but it did so without foundation. Every subsequent effort would be shaped by what was no longer available. The early missteps did not cause the mystery, but they ensured it would endure. And so, from its very beginning, the case moved forward not on evidence, but on absence, a pattern that would define everything that followed. As the investigation struggled to find firm ground, attention gradually shifted toward individuals whose names surfaced through proximity, rumor, or circumstance. In the absence of clear evidence, suspicion became diffuse. It did not settle in one place for long. It moved quietly from person to person, shaped as much by fear and pressure as by fact. One of the earliest names to attract attention was Frank Fernando Jones, a prominent local businessman and state senator. Jones had previously employed Josiah Moore, and there were accounts of tension related to business dealings. In a town searching for explanation, familiarity and status made him visible. He was questioned and scrutinized, but no evidence connected him to the murders. The accusations lingered largely because of his prominence rather than proof. Another figure often mentioned was William Mansfield, a transient laborer and former military man. Mansfield fit a profile that appealed to investigators at the time. He traveled frequently, possessed a violent history, and did not maintain stable ties. Some believed he could have passed through Villisca unnoticed. He was questioned extensively and even tried in connection with other crimes, but he was never convicted for the Villisca murders. His name persisted in part because of how neatly it fit emerging theories about a roaming offender. There was also Henry Lee Moore, an individual later convicted of other axe murders. His crimes bore similarities in method, and this overlap drew attention. Authorities considered whether the Villisca murders could be part of a broader pattern. Despite the parallels, timelines and locations did not align convincingly enough to establish responsibility. Suspicion followed him, but certainty did not. Beyond these names, many others surfaced briefly. Local residents were questioned simply because they lived nearby. Travelers were investigated because they passed through town. Anyone who appeared out of place became a potential explanation. Accusations were made quietly, sometimes publicly, often without evidence. For those accused, the shadow lingered long after inquiries ended. What complicated this phase was the nature of information itself. Statements conflicted, memories shifted. Witnesses recalled details differently as time passed. Without physical evidence to anchor claims, stories took on a life of their own. Each retelling added emphasis, removed context, or introduced assumption. Authorities attempted to sort rumor from relevance. They conducted interviews, compared timelines, and weighed inconsistencies. But without a clear starting point, every suspect felt possible and unprovable at the same time. The investigation lacked a center of gravity. Public pressure intensified the problem. The scale of the crime demanded resolution, and the absence of answers created discomfort. Naming suspects offered temporary relief. It suggested movement. It implied progress. But each accusation that failed to hold only deepened frustration. Trials were held. Charges were brought. Acquittals followed. In the most notable proceedings, suspects were arrested and placed before juries. Evidence was presented. Arguments were made. And yet, none of the cases resulted in conviction. Doubt remained stronger than certainty. Each legal outcome reinforced the same conclusion. The truth was still out of reach. Over time, the list of suspects grew longer, not shorter. Names were added, revisited, and set aside. Some were remembered only locally. Others entered broader discussion through books and articles. None emerged with proof strong enough to settle the case. This phase of the investigation revealed something important. The absence of evidence does not prevent accusation. It encourages it. When clarity is missing, people search for narratives that feel complete, even if they are unsupported. In Villisca, accusation became a way to manage uncertainty. For the families, this period was painful. Each new suspect raised hope, only to let it fall again. Each accusation stirred attention, then faded. Closure remained just beyond reach, retreating with every attempt to grasp it. The case did not fail because suspects were not named. It failed because none of the accusations could withstand scrutiny. The murders resisted being placed into a single human outline. They did not conform to a face or a motive that could be held long enough to become truth. And so, the chapter of suspects closed without conclusion. not because possibilities were exhausted, but because none could stand alone. The accusations passed through Villisca like shadows, touching many lives without settling anywhere, and the case moved forward once more, unchanged, carrying with it the quiet weight of names that explained nothing and resolved nothing at all. As local suspects failed to provide answers, the focus of the investigation slowly expanded beyond Villisca itself. Investigators and later researchers began to consider whether the crime might not belong solely to the town, but to a wider pattern that extended across regions and years. This shift did not come from new evidence, but from comparison. In the years surrounding 1912, a series of violent crimes occurred across the Midwest and southern United States that shared unsettling similarities. Entire households were attacked at night. Victims were asleep. Axes were often used, sometimes taken from the homes themselves. As with Villisca, these crimes frequently left little evidence behind and resulted in no convictions. The similarities invited connection. The idea of a traveling killer offered a way to explain how such violence could appear suddenly and vanish just as quietly. A transient individual could move unnoticed from town to town, entering communities briefly and leaving behind confusion rather than clarity. In an era defined by rail travel and limited record-keeping, movement was easy to lose track of. Railroads became central to this theory. Towns like Villisca were connected by train lines that allowed strangers to arrive and depart without drawing attention. Laborers, travelers, and seasonal workers passed through regularly. Their presence was common enough not to invite scrutiny, yet brief enough to leave little trace. Supporters of this theory pointed to recurring details. Victims were often covered after death. Windows and mirrors were sometimes obscured. Attacks occurred during late-night hours when towns slept deeply. The crimes did not involve theft or ransom. They appeared purposeful but unexplained, repeated without variation. Yet even these similarities resisted certainty. Patterns can emerge naturally when viewed across time. Not every shared detail implies the same hand. Axes were common tools in rural homes. Nighttime offered opportunity, regardless of intent. The absence of evidence made it difficult to separate coincidence from design. Investigators of the time lacked the means to connect crimes across jurisdictions effectively. Communication between towns was slow and inconsistent. Records were incomplete. Without centralized databases, the idea of a single individual responsible for multiple crimes remained speculative. Still, the traveling killer theory endured. It endured because it explained what local theories could not. It accounted for the lack of motive tied to Villisca. It explained why no suspect remained present. It allowed the crime to exist without connection to personal conflict or familiarity. Over time, this theory expanded beyond investigation into cultural memory. Writers, historians, and criminologists revisited the idea, tracing timelines and locations, attempting to overlay crimes into a single narrative. Some saw strong alignment, others saw forced connections. The debate continued without resolution. The broader theories did not replace local ones. They existed alongside them. Some believed the killer was methodical. Others believed the violence was opportunistic. Some saw ritual or symbolism. Others saw repetition without meaning. Each interpretation revealed as much about the observer as about the crime. What all theories shared was limitation. None could be proven. None could be dismissed entirely. The lack of definitive evidence kept every possibility alive, suspended between plausibility and doubt. The traveling killer theory remains compelling not because it answers the question, but because it mirrors the crime itself. It moves quietly. It leaves impressions rather than proof. It suggests presence without permanence. In the end, expanding the scope of the investigation did not bring resolution. It only widened the silence. The murders at Villisca did not become clearer when viewed as part of something larger. They remained singular in their impact, defined by stillness rather than pattern. Whether the crime was isolated or connected, local or wandering, known or unknown, it refused to settle into explanation. And so, the theory traveled on, from town to town, from decade to decade, always present, never confirmed. A possibility that explained nothing fully, yet refused to disappear. As years passed without resolution, the investigation into the Villisca murders entered a formal phase that many hoped would finally bring clarity. Suspicions that had circulated quietly now moved into courtrooms, where certainty was expected to replace speculation. What followed, however, did not bring answers. It brought silence of a different kind. The most prominent legal proceedings centered on individuals who had already been discussed widely within the community. Arrests were made, not because evidence demanded them, but because pressure did. The town, the families, and the wider public needed something to hold on to. Trials offered structure where uncertainty had reigned, courtrooms filled with testimony. Witnesses spoke about behavior, rumors, and impressions. Timelines were reconstructed from memory rather than record. Prosecutors presented narratives built from circumstance rather than physical proof. Defense attorneys highlighted inconsistencies, gaps, and the absence of direct evidence. The cases did not hinge on what was known, but on what could be argued. In each trial, the same problem emerged. There was no forensic evidence linking any defendant to the house. No eyewitness placed anyone inside during the night. No object tied a suspect directly to the act. Without these anchors, arguments floated rather than settled. Jurors were asked to choose between stories, not facts. Verdicts reflected that uncertainty. Acquittals followed. Charges were dismissed. Suspects walked free. The legal system did what it was designed to do when proof is insufficient. It refused to convict. For many, this outcome felt incomplete rather than unjust. The absence of conviction did not feel like innocence proven. It felt like truth withheld. Each acquittal reshaped the case. Rather than narrowing focus, it widened doubt. If one suspect could not be proven responsible, perhaps none could. Or perhaps the wrong people had been placed on trial entirely. Confidence in any single explanation eroded further with each failed proceeding. Public attention slowly shifted. New cases emerged elsewhere. Time moved on. Newspapers stopped printing daily updates. The courthouse returned to routine matters. The Villisca murders receded from immediate focus, not because they were solved, but because they resisted resolution. For the families, the end of trials did not bring relief. There was no sense of closure. The legal process had not answered the central question. It had only confirmed what they already knew, that certainty was unreachable. The acquittals closed doors without opening others. Law enforcement continued to hold the case open. Files remained, notes were preserved. Occasionally, leads were revisited, but without new evidence, movement was limited. The case entered a period defined not by activity, but by endurance. Silence settled in gradually. It was not the silence of forgetting, but the silence of waiting without expectation. The story no longer advanced. It remained suspended, unchanged by time or effort. The trials had marked the last moment when resolution felt possible through official means. When they ended without answers, the case shifted permanently. It became part of history rather than current investigation. The courtroom doors closed, the suspects faded from focus, and the murders returned to the place they had occupied from the beginning. A quiet space between certainty and absence, where questions remained unanswered and the truth did not rise to meet them. In Villisca, the trials did not conclude the story. They confirmed that some stories do not end with verdicts. they end with silence. After the investigations slowed and the courtrooms fell silent, the house on 2nd Street remained. It did not disappear with the questions that surrounded it. It stood in Villisca, as it always had, its shape unchanged, its walls intact, carrying forward a presence that felt heavier than before. In the months following the murders, the house became a place people avoided. Windows stayed dark, doors remained closed. The familiarity that once defined it was replaced by distance. Neighbors passed by without looking too long. Children were warned away. The house existed, but it no longer belonged to daily life. Over time, ownership changed. New residents attempted to live within its walls, hoping that time would soften what memory had hardened. Some stayed briefly, others left quietly. Accounts emerged of unease, of discomfort that could not be easily explained. Whether these experiences were shaped by knowledge or by imagination mattered less than the fact that the house resisted becoming ordinary again. The town itself moved on cautiously. Streets were repaved, businesses changed hands, generations passed, yet the house remained fixed in memory. It became less a location and more a reference. People spoke of it indirectly. It was the house everyone knew without needing to name. As decades passed, interest returned in a different form. Historians, writers, and visitors began to see the house not only as a site of tragedy, but as a place that represented unanswered history. The absence of resolution drew attention rather than repelled it. People traveled to Villisca, seeking understanding rather than spectacle. Eventually, the house was preserved. It became a historical site, maintained not to sensationalize the crime, but to acknowledge its place in the town's story. Rooms were kept as they had been. The structure was stabilized. The house shifted from private residence to collective memory. This transformation altered how the house was experienced. It was no longer a place where life continued, but a place where time paused. Visitors walked through quietly, aware that the walls held stories that could not be told fully. The house did not explain itself. It did not offer answers. It simply remained. What is striking is how little the house reveals. There are no hidden compartments, no markings that explain the night, no object that suddenly clarifies what happened. The house gives nothing back. It stands as it always did, a reminder that places can absorb events without releasing meaning, that walls can witness without remembering, that absence can be preserved just as surely as presence. For Villisca, the house became a boundary between past and present, between what is known and what is not, between ordinary life and something that disrupted it permanently. The house afterward did not bring closure. It brought endurance. It allowed the story to remain without resolution, carried forward through care rather than conclusion. It became a space where questions were allowed to exist without demand for answers. And in that way, the house continues its quiet role, not as evidence, not as explanation, but as a place that holds the silence left behind, unchanged by time, waiting without expectation. The house remains, and with it, the unanswered night remains as well. With time, the events in Villisca moved from lived experience into memory. What once felt immediate and overwhelming slowly settled into something quieter, carried forward not by answers, but by remembrance. The town learned to live alongside the absence, even as it never truly understood it. There was no moment when the story concluded, no final discovery that brought clarity. Instead, the case faded into a kind of stillness, where questions remained present but no longer demanded response. Life continued, not because the mystery was resolved, but because it had to. For the families affected, the aftermath was not marked by closure, but by endurance. Without certainty, grief could not follow a familiar path. There was no clear ending to mourn, only an open space where understanding should have been. Time passed, but it did not complete the story. It simply carried it forward. For the town, the murders altered something subtle but permanent. Familiarity no longer guaranteed safety. Quiet no longer meant peace. The assumptions that had shaped daily life were adjusted quietly, without announcement. Doors were locked more carefully. Nights were listened to more closely. Yet even this change softened with time. New generations grew up knowing the story as history rather than memory. The house became a reference point rather than a presence. The murders were spoken of gently, carefully, as something that belonged to another era, even though their impact had never fully left. What remains most striking is not the violence itself, but the silence that followed it. The lack of answers did not produce chaos. It produced reflection. The case became a reminder that not everything yields to investigation, and not every question is meant to be resolved. Some events remain intact precisely because they resist explanation. The story of the Villisca Axe Murders endures not because of what is known, but because of what is not. It reminds us that ordinary places can hold extraordinary absence, that routine can coexist with mystery, that history does not always arrange itself into conclusions. As this story settles, there is no need to reach for meaning or resolution. You do not need to solve it. You do not need to imagine an ending. You can allow it to remain as it is, incomplete and quiet. The town returned to routine. The house remained standing, and the questions stayed where they were. Now, as the night continues, you are free to let the story rest. Let the silence remain gentle. Let your thoughts slow without direction. Nothing more is required. The past can remain where it belongs, and you can rest, knowing the story does not ask anything further of you.